What's up guys, it's Punchy, and today it's time for the final chapter as we rank every single weapon in all of Deepwoken. We first started with the light, moved on to the medium, and finally we'll complete this series by ranking every single heavy and elemental legendary that I left off at the end of this list. Of course, if you want a full understanding of my ranking criteria, please watch the other videos in this series, but I will tie them all together at the end so it's more unified. I'll do my best to inform you about every single weapon and rank it with my opinion based on their combat performance, diversity in builds and combat, and if it's really unique. First, I'll break down the tier list, but feel free to skip through if you've seen this in these similar videos, or you just want to go right to the rankings. And that's about it. To start off our ranking with the tier list breakdown, all the way at the top we have S tier, which is self-explanatory. These weapons perform well while being diverse, unique, and fun. A tier, solid and reliable picks for any type of gameplay, but they just aren't hitting that peak. B tier, decent options that can be useful in a few different situations but aren't as capable as the others. C tier, these weapons exist. Finally, we have D tier. D stands for don't use this weapon. Either it's bad, boring, and useless, whatever it may be, you should probably never pick this up unless you're progressing a build. Underneath this, we have a special category specifically for weapons that could use a rework, buff, or unique crit. Of course, I'll still explain their viability as well, but I wouldn't consider these as great options since they're missing something vital to their kit. Now, without further ado, let's begin ranking every single Deepwoken weapon, starting with Fist. Now, let's begin with the heavy weapons with our starter Battle Axe. Throughout your progression, this weapon is great for damage, consistently breaking blocks, free enchant, and the heavy uppercut is exactly what it needs to be. It's a good pick for building your character, but clearly outstatted in endgame, leaving the Battle Axe behind in D tier. On to the next with the Alloyed Halberd. I absolutely love this weapon's critical mobility and decently fast swing speed. In a world of slow options, the Halberd moves quickly with 0 M1 and lag, bridging the gap between slow heavy weapons and mediums. The Halberd sits safely in a solid A tier placement. Moving on to the Alloyed Aggression Axe, a personal favorite weapon of mine. Since the Aggression Axe has super fast swing speed, it's very easy to take advantage of the viable but normal heavy crit. Alongside some wind gems and movement mantras, I think this weapon can really work. It's decent if you know what you're doing, so I'll place the Aggression Axe in a B tier placement. Mixing it up with a weird choice, we have the Alloyed Canorian Axe. I'll be honest, there's not really much going on here with this axe's slower swing speed, and I'd rather pick something else. I think the Canorian Axe deserves better within the possible rework or critical section. Moving along, we have the Iron Birch. Surprisingly, this weapon isn't very strong. It doesn't have an alloy, it has really bad posture and mid damage, but the cool part comes into play with its 0 end lag. It's an okay weapon, but I wouldn't use this if you're looking for gameplay diversity. The Iron Birch gets slammed into C tier. Finally, we're back with the classic, the Evan Spears Hand Axe. Believe it or not, this thing is the pure icon for PvE, dealing the most damage out of any heavy weapon and probably weapon in the entire game. In theory, you could probably one-shot players with the Evan Spear Axe, and we already know it's the peak of monster hunting. The Evan Spear Hand Axe earns its position up in S tier for very self-explanatory reasons. Next up, we have the Night Axe. Despite its pretty cool name, the only unique attribute of this weapon is its ungodly chip damage. With the highest chip damage in the entire game, we can seriously hit hard against blocking players, but then, once again, just use the stone enchant if you want to do better. Sadly, I'm gonna throw this in C tier. After this, let's discuss the Master Hawk's Hand Axe. Suffering from many of the same issues as the filler mid-level Greataxes, there's nothing really build defining about this weapon. Although it kinda just exists, nobody really picks it up unless they're going for drip, so the Master Hawk's Hand Axe places in C tier. Recently updated, we also have the Relic Axe. This axe has a very special crit that has possible mantra confirms and a whole lot of cheese. Although I don't think its potential has really been showcased by a really good player, I think there are options for very specific playstyles that can work. I'll rank the Relic Axe as B tier because it is something different that can actually work. Back to the classics, we have the Enforcer Axe. Performing well in both PvE and PvP, this weapon and its crit are very hard to parry with insane damage. If people sleep on this option, watch out for it because it hits hard and synergizes with a bunch of playstyles, so solid B tier placement for the Enforcer Axe. After this, we have the Skyreap Blade, another crazy Hollowtide weapon and the only Deepwoken scythe. This thing is really cool. The animations are weird and hard to deal with, but our damage is low alongside unexpected end lag, so I'd love to see a special crit and the removal of end lag, but until then, it's stuck in B tier. With a fairly new weapon, we have the Pale Briar. This Greataxe is kind of crazy with its huge AoE crit which procs enchants and stun players, topped off with ridiculous posture damage. If you're playing PvE or simply cheesing players in PvP, there's a ton of gameplay diversity with the Pale Briar. I'll place this in S tier because we can truly do a lot with this weapon. Starting off with our greatswords, let's discuss the Avenger. A zero cost enchantable greatsword isn't really that bad, but why not use the battle axe? Sorry to say it, but the Avenger stays in D tier on endgame level builds. Up next, we got the Alloyed Zweihander. Although basic, this thing hits hard with great range and solid posture damage. Roll stacking with this option is pretty viable on many different builds, landing the Zweihander a solid ranking in B tier. Moving on, we have a very weird weapon, the Alloyed Markor's Inheritor. With fully normal greatsword M1s alongside a strange Neve crit, I want this weapon to be good, but it just isn't that good. The critical definitely doesn't hold up to a normal greatsword crit, so why wouldn't you just want that? I do know there are possible builds that abuse this weapon, but there's clearly better options that serve the same purpose. For now, the Markor's Inheritor kind of just exists, leaving it down in a C tier placement. Going further, let's mention the Alloyed Crescent Cleaver. This weapon has its own special place in certain builds with decent damage and a cool slam down crit, but it's immediately blown out of the water by the Curse Cleave, a direct upgrade. Sticking with the C theme, the Crescent Cleaver goes down in C tier. Next up, with the classic Deepwoken hitter, we got the Dark Steel or Dark Alloy Greatsword. With high damage M1s and a full hyper armor critical, this functions as a get out of jail free card and a free vent. If I'm being honest, the Dark Steel Greatsword needs some sort of competency and game experience to use effectively, but it is good alongside the heavy uppercut mix. This places fairly high with a solid A tier placement. Moving on to the Inquisitor's Straight Sword. There's really not too much to say about this weapon, but it's a fast greatsword option that doesn't require that many points. With a good status enchant, this thing slaps, but I'd say it's valid, leaving this weapon in B tier. A weird new legendary option, we have the Curse Seeger. To be fair, this weapon works very well with a solid chargeable laser beam and zero end lag M1s. There's basically infinite cheese potential that can lead or set up charge beams, and that's really fun. I think it's a cool pick, but the charisma proc on crit and charisma requirements hold back this weapon from being really nice. Like, why does it even need this? The Curse Seeger is restricted and held back into A tier because of that wasted charisma. Onto a fan favorite, we have the First Light. This greatsword is truly special, more unique than a few actual legendary options. With a near unavoidable annoying crit, crazy new animations, and a sick enchantable design, I can't lie, this greatsword has a lot going for it. For now, I'll place this in a mid-level A tier since I think the crit cooldown needs to be a little bit lower. Now, let's talk about the Curse Cleave, a direct upgrade to the Crescent Cleaver. This weapon has an S tier competitive viability as a greatsword, but only with a few different builds. Yes, it performs well with a few enchant combos, but those specific playstyles kill the build diversity of this weapon. Although its stats are simply overtuned, you only really see this with the Nemesis enchant or other cheese options. I'll rate the Curse Cleave as an A tier option because it's only used with the same few builds. Next up, we have the Railblade, a truly special greatsword. After a few different balance changes, the Railblade's multiple crits fell a bit lower with the bonus upside of enchant, but there's so much that we can do with this weapon. Mantra combos work, crit confirms work, enchants work, and it also does decent damage. Although its competitive viability isn't the top of the top, it works with almost any playstyle and build, resulting in a final S tier placement. Finishing off the greatsword category, we have the Enforcer Greatsword. This pick is pretty nice with decently fast swing speed, a good spinning crit, and zero end lag on your swings. Sure, it's pretty fun, but its high stat requirements can really hurt your build, so if I'm being honest, just use the Railblade instead if you want a fast option. option. The Enforcer Greatsword is placed with a B tier ranking. Beginning the Greathammer category, we finally have the Alloyed Steel Maul. To be fair, this hammer is a filler option, so it has to be kinda mid. The stats realistically aren't that bad, but it also won't make or break your build, and it's boring. It's a solid pick that works, earning a B tier placement. Once again, with the filler options that don't do anything special, we have a cool looking one, the Forge Greathammer. Seriously, this weapon looks crazy, but its stats are underwhelming and it's overall just a forgotten option. This exists and that's about it, leaving it down below in C tier. Mixing it up with a cool mob drop, we have the Great Maul. Being a giant hammer that hits hard, we got some solid stats alongside a really cool appearance. I'm kinda sad there's little to no tech that we can abuse with this golem drop, but I think it deserves a place right next to the Steel Maul at B tier. Moving on to the Pale Morning, a Deepwoken classic weapon. This weapon is simply good with decent stats and a hard-hitting crit. To be honest, I'd prefer if this option had its own special critical, but without it, it's still a B tier or A tier weapon based off the stats, and it also works on many builds. Finishing off all the Hollowtide weapons, we have the Putrid Eden Staff Greathammer. This weapon has a sick design with a very weird ranged crit that knocks players down and snipes them. Besides this, it also procs enchants from a distance, and I definitely feel like a mage weapon like this should be more magey and have lower requirements. The Putrid Eden Staff certainly isn't bad, solidifying its rank as a B tier weapon, but the requirements are a bit too high for me to use. You know I had to say it, it's time for the Petra's Anchor. This hammer is one of the greatest with a fast, unique startup crit that does ridiculous damage and sends players flying. There's so much capability with the movement alone, but the high damage and decent posture make it one of the best. Petra's Anchor easily fits at the top with an S tier ranking. Moving on to the new Sovereign's Punishment. Since it's a giant hammer, this thing is a true slow stat stick. It's very slow but hits hard and could use a special critical. I'll place this at B tier since build diversity is just an option for the Sovereign's Punishment. Next up with the Enforcer Hammer. I won't lie, these stats are very similar to the original Enforcer Axe, but it sacrifices hit damage for extended posture pressure. I consider this tied up with the OG, slapping it right next to the axe at a solid B tier spot. Another golem weapon, we have the Stoneheart. It's worth mentioning that this weapon deals insane posture and damage on hit, but it gets even better against better players. When fighting those who don't predict parry or just parry because they want to, the Stoneheart gets kinda slapped, but reactionary players that wait and try to react, they get hit very hard by the Stoneheart. Also, the crit is special with a pretty cool learning curve, so I'll put the Stoneheart at a solid A tier placement if you know what you're doing. With the final heavy weapon, we got the Hive Lord's Hubris. Okay, this weapon swings slow, very slow, and it's basically only used alongside the Heavy Hands ring. I won't lie, it's very boring and funny to play for about 10 minutes, but build diversity with this weapon is practically non-existent. I'll put this in B tier because it can work well, but that's about it. Now, it's time for the final section of our tier list, the entire Legendary Elemental section. There's a bit to discuss, but I'll try to keep it brief, and let's begin. Starting off with the Ignition Deep Crusher, there's a few things holding this weapon back. A lot of people forget that this weapon is 2-in-1. The stronger two-handed hammer places rods on hit, and the faster sword doesn't place rods, so why are we using this? I'll be honest, there's almost no reason to use the sword variant of the Deep Crusher, and the easy to counter crit doesn't really help its case. Although its stat requirements drop significantly, the Ignition Deep Crusher still feels like half a weapon and is just kinda boring. Slapping this down in B tier since it works decently in different builds. In contrast, we have a great weapon, the Curved Blade of Winds. This sword has so much capability with setups, combos with multiple crits, proccing multiple attunement talents with varying playstyles as well. The Curved Blade of Winds works with a ton of setups and performs well too, placing it at an S tier rating, and that's all I gotta say. It's just very good. After that, we have the Storm's Eye. This rifle isn't exactly a rifle and shouldn't really be considered as one because it has insane pressure up close. With insane rushdown capability with a broken M1 hitbox, ridiculous flourish range, air teleport, and iframe crit, abusing this weapon isn't difficult to do. S stands for Storm's Eye, and it definitely belongs in this category for its build diversity alone. Onto a crazy pick, we got the Crypt Blade. This weapon works well in almost any situation with cheese builds, hybrid combos, solid shadow lockdown, or basically anything. The Crypt Blade excels in almost almost all builds that have a simple combo piece with its critical or shadow steel, and that's enough to place it at a high S tier ranking. After this, we have the Grand Sudaruska. This axe has some solid damage with a ridiculous crit hitbox and multiple techie options. There's a ton of different mantra combos that set up solid crit play, and it's also not really a bad pick. Besides this, I think that build diversity with this weapon is also kind of fairly limited with a few different options, but we see a lot of the same. Personally, I'd love to see crazier builds with this weapon, but it doesn't stand up that, comparatively to the Crypt or Curve Blade. The Grand Sudaruska is great, leaving it at a mid-level A tier placement. Next up, we got the Isley's Pyre Keeper. I'll be honest, this weapon can do absolutely anything, proccing flame on hit, triggering every single flame talent, and of course it has 5 different crits with hyper armor, for basically any situation. The performance and build diversity with this weapon is something insane and basically cannot be downplayed. So yeah, I gotta put the Isleys as an S tier weapon. Now for the final rating of all Deepwoken weapons, I'll be discussing, I guess, all of the hero blades in a single section. It's without overestimating that each hero blade excels in full elemental mage builds and works very well with specialized hybrid element options as well. Although each attunement has an area of expertise with their specific crits, I think it's safe to say that each weapon has a time and place for usage and I guess is solid in A tier. Also in the future, I believe hero blades will have a big use in the Saint Sworn Hero Blade Oath, so keep an eye out for that. And that's about everything. And that's it. We finally finished ranking every single weapon in Deepwoken. Well, we're missing a few, which I will update. That's all for every single heavy and elemental weapon, and don't worry, everything will be updated and be combined into a full video with all 3 rankings, and yeah, that's gonna be pretty long. As always, if you like what I do, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's hit 85k subs. Thanks again, it's punchin' time.